Most reform efforts to the National Emergency Act propose that Congress affirmatively approve each national emergency. So my question for you is, what is the value of having Congress approve rather than disapprove each emergency? And Mr. Healy, I want you to weigh in on this too, please. Mr. Fallon.
Well, I think I would slightly modify that in the first instance, most of the proposals do not require Congress to approve, but for a certain time limit. So after a certain period, so 30, 60 days, it would require Congress to approve any extension of that. And in the failure of Congress to decide to extend it, it would be ended by default. So I think, again, the original NEA had a disapproval mechanism that got around the presidential veto, but of course they didn't. I don't believe the authors anticipated a court decision that would invalidate that structure. I think the original authors of the National Emergencies Act, if they were addressing this issue now, would do what is in many of the recent proposals, which is by default, Congress has to assert its approval or the emergency ends by default. I think disapproving is just a much higher barrier, and that it's what we result in now.
Ms. Goethe, I'm going to want you to weigh in too, but Mr. Healy?
Yes, I think that's right. I think the frameworks for emergency powers reform that we see now reflect the Chadha decision, getting rid of the legislative veto. And, all of them, the Protecting Our Democracy Act, Article 1 Act, the other bills that have been proposed, are based on an approve or expire framework in which the president will have 30 days in the case of a genuine national emergency to unlock these powers. But if the emergency persists and these powers are thought to be necessary, this weapon is supposed to remain available, then Congress has to vote. So I think they all are, the shape of the statutes we see are a reflection of what the Supreme Court did in Chadha, and a way to, given that decision, to reassert Congress's authority over these matters, rather than what has happened since 1985 with the removal of the legislative veto. We're really in an upside-down constitutional situation where the president proposes and essentially the president disposes, and it takes a veto-proof supermajority for Congress to reassert its authority. And these are designed to turn the Constitution, to turn the emergency powers practice right side up.
Very good. Ms. Goethe?
I agree with what's been said. It's important to remember also that a national emergency declaration gives the president access to truly extraordinary powers and to a degree of flexibility and discretion that would not be appropriate during ordinary times, and that Congress hasn't chosen to give the president during ordinary times. And for that reason, Congress wanted to make it easy to exercise some restraint on the president if the president abused those extraordinary powers. And that's why Congress chose the legislative veto mechanism. Now that that's off the table, the existing mechanisms for disapproval require such a high bar that they stack the deck very much in favor of the president and against Congress. It throws the balance of power out of whack. The closest way to approximate the balance of power in the original National Emergencies Act is the mechanism that's been proposed in these reform bills, which is an automatic expiration period of approximately 30 days. I think in some cases it's 20, depending on the bill, unless Congress votes using expedited procedures, which means that it would be a simple majority vote where any member could force a vote. This would prevent obstructionism. Congress would be voting, and a simple majority would carry the day. But it would put Congress back in the position of being able to exercise a check on these extraordinary powers.
Very good. It's important for these reforms to be nonpartisan, to understand that we're talking about executive power regardless of who is in that office and what party they may be from. We have three experts, three of you here before us here today. I would just like to get a sense, and all of this is up to to all of you, so anyone who wants to chime in. Do you believe that there's a bipartisan consensus among experts, among policy experts, as to how we reform the National Emergency Act, and how would you characterize that right now? Whoever wants to go first.
I mean, this is self-selecting among the experts I've spoken to. There's widespread agreement. I think the folks who have written and studied this issue agree with this central conclusion that the NEA, as structurally intended, was fairly thoughtful, but for an unforeseen judicial decision, it rendered it fairly inert. And so the best way to address that is with a reform that creates this, that inverts the structure. I'd also note it's helpful to think of these reforms as not just purely oppositional, the Congress versus the executive, but it provides and in fact forces Congress to take a stand on emergency declarations. If it truly is an emergency that's self-evident, that's maybe existential in nature, then it should be possible for the president to gather the political support to extend that emergency and that response. So it actually provides an Article I imprimatur on any emergency declaration. And regardless of how Congress disposes, it forces Congress to have to step up and say, I'm taking a stand on this, whether it's yes or no to continue it.
Anyone like to add to that? Ms. Goiti?
I would agree with that. And of all the issues I've worked on in, I guess almost 20 years at this point of doing this type of work, this issue probably has the broadest and deepest bipartisan support, not just among policy experts, but among members of Congress who I've spoken with. And there is a fundamental understanding that this is not a partisan issue, but an issue of separation of powers, and that the separation of powers is not an optional feature of the Constitution that can be switched on or off depending on who is in the White House. It is a vital protection for our democracy. And emergency powers can be abused and have been abused by presidents of both parties. So this is fundamentally not a partisan issue. It's an issue of safeguarding individual liberties, of safeguarding our democracy, and I think that's well understood.
We're over time, but Mr. Healy, you have a quick response?
I don't have much to add to what my co-panelists have said. Yes, I think this is both within the policy community, such as it is, and on Capitol Hill, this is an issue that gets a lot of bipartisan support because it really, we should take a longer time horizon and recognize that at any given point, somebody may like what a president does with a vast delegation of unilateral powers, but this over time it erodes separation of powers and the rule of law, and I think we've seen that in the last two administrations, and we've seen bipartisan support for reforming it.
Ms. Goyden, your research shows that presidents have only recently begun to really push the bounds of the emergency powers in their policy priorities. So my question for you is, why do you think that's the case? Why are we really now seeing this recently where we didn't see it before? And the other two witnesses, feel free to chime in as well. But Ms. Goyden.
To be clear, there have been abuses of emergency powers in the past, but the most egregious abuses that we've seen in the last 100 years in this country have been based on claims of inherent constitutional authority, not statutory emergency powers. So that was the case for the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, for example. That was also the case with the torture of detainees after 9/11. When it comes to the powers available under the National Emergencies Act, there has been remarkably little abuse or misuse, other than IEPA, which really has to be considered separately for some of the reasons that we've talked about. When presidents have declared national emergencies, it's been few and far between, and it has generally been in response to a sudden, unexpected crisis that required immediate action. And the reason for this, and this is really more of a description than an explanation, I think, has been a norm of self-restraint on the part of presidents who have access to these powers. And the problem with that is that once these norms are shattered, they are extremely difficult to put back together. President Trump opened the door to abusing statutory emergency powers when he declared a national emergency to secure funding for the border wall after Congress had refused to provide that funding. President Biden nudged the door open a little bit more when he relied on emergency powers to forgive student loan debt, again, after Congress had considered legislation to forgive debt and had not passed that legislation. I think we have had a norm that has protected us. And now that that norm has been set aside, I'm concerned that we could see more of these misuses of emergency powers in the future.
I don't think I can draw a conclusion about the long sweep of history and the increased use of emergency, but I'll say that in our time working on this issue at the committee, it was different emergencies that motivated both Democrats and Republicans on the committee. I think if I could, I'm in the weird position of speaking for people who are sitting on this very dais, which I think constitutes hearsay. But some of the Democrats on the committee were motivated, were interested in this topic by that border wall emergency, right? It crystallized this notion of creative uses of emergency power that seemed beyond what was delegated by Congress. Later on, COVID, the student loan emergencies drew interest, especially from more the Republican side of the committee or in Congress. I think the point is, if you create a policy-neutral mechanism that's kind of a meta law, you don't have to, well, I don't say you don't have to worry. I think what you do is you don't address a specific emergency. You're addressing the whole notion of emergency powers. And that's one thing that I was proud to have been able to work on, even though different members of the committee were kind of drawn to the legislation for different reasons or in response to different reasons. It arrived at the same answer. And I would note during that time, nobody on the committee that I spoke to raised an objection with the thrust of the legislation. There were disagreements about whether IEPA should be included and so on, but nobody disagreed that this was something that wasn't worthy of the committee's time.
Reform proposals that are right now before us allow Congress to approve an emergency for a set period of time. And at the end of that period, then Congress can renew the emergency with another vote. So my question is, what do you think is an appropriate amount of time for a national emergency to last before it needs to be renewed by Congress? And if anyone else would like to.
This was subject to some deliberation also in the committee when we were considering these. This is a prudential question, and this is exactly the kind of thing that Congress is supposed to figure out. On some level, look, it's arbitrary because you are setting a time limit that is not correlated to the actual emergency in that time. But I think anything more than 60 days is. You're going to a quarter of a year, 90 days, that's not an emergency. And again, I guess the point is less about what is the appropriate specific time limit and more about Congress should have to weigh in and continue to weigh in if it's extended. And that's a policymaking muscle that Congress has not exercised in a long time. And so I think somewhere between 30 and 60 days is appropriate, but the specifics we have to leave to you.
Other thoughts?
I think 30 days, which is the amount of time in most of these reform proposals, is a sensible amount of time. It gives the president enough time to implement at least the first wave of whatever actions the president's going to take in response to the emergency. It gives Congress time to see how the president is addressing the emergency, how the emergency is unfolding. And then Congress can weigh in. If Congress extends the emergency, then it would go back to the usual yearly renewal. But instead of the president being the one to renew the declaration unilaterally, Congress would again have to approve it. Now, some versions of National Emergencies Act reform also include a 5-year cap on the total amount of time that an emergency declaration could be periodically renewed by Congress. And the idea behind that is to prevent this phenomenon of permanent emergencies. 5 years into an emergency, it's not an emergency, it's a new normal. And arguably, it should be addressed through permanent authorities. If existing non-emergency authorities aren't sufficient, then Congress should be passing new ones. So that's another feature of some of these reform proposals that's worth consideration.